the Swans do it? Sullivan! Who would have thought the sequel would be just as good as the original? The West Coast...
In 2005 and 6, Sydney and West Coast played out two of the greatest grand finals the game ever saw. They created a legacy which will stand the test of time, based on some of the best players to ever do it, and some of the greatest moments ever witnessed.
Here it is!
But behind the scenes, this era of mid-2000s brilliance was interesting for reasons that were speculated about, but not revealed until years later. And these events are part of one of the AFL's darkest scandals, centering around the culture of the West and the pieces of shredded legacy and success left on the floor in Perth. This is a story of triumph, failure, but ultimately a world of untapped potential, never to be fully realised. This is the story of the turn of the century West Coast Eagles. In 2006, while on an end-of-season trip to Vegas, a West Coast Eagles player collapsed outside a hotel. The story was run in The Age in early 2007 and opened the floodgates for a topic that had been quietly spoken about, but never taken to the mainstream. After the story was run, the journalist Andrew Rule was contacted by someone who had information on another developing story in the same space. Details emerged of how this person had helped a shivering Ben Cousins, found asleep on a Melbourne street in December of 2006, and all of a sudden, problems at the Eagles busted wide open. Fast forward to late 2007 and the AFL Commission has to do something. They enlist the big dogs, retired Supreme Court Judge William Gillard. His task? To uncover a decade's worth of dirt and compose a report detailing the extent of the culture at the West Coast. He presented his secret report to the AFL in February of 2008 for them to make a decision on the next course of action. And recently, that previously secret report was made public for the very first time. The earliest of misconduct relating to illicit substance use dates all the way back to 1998, with a certain depressant being the choice brand. This usage quickly turned into stimulants. In 2001, Michael Gardner and Ben Cousins got in strife after it was reported that they were conversing with WA underworld criminal figures. They spoke frequently with convicted trafficker John Kizon and were reprimanded by the Eagles. In 2002, Gardner was involved in an assault incident at a bar for which he was dropped from the team. Soon after, on Mad Monday, Cousins broke his arm in a fight with teammate Daniel Kerr, and that same time, Andrew Embley was charged with assaulting a man in a bar brawl. 2004 was not much better for off-field issues. In May, Quinton Lynch was charged with drink driving and attempting to flee the scene. He was fined $5,000 by the club. In October, another serious offence. A prescription form was stolen from club doctors and forged in order for Daniel Kerr to purchase approximately 50 prescription pills to, quote, prolong a high. The understanding was that the prescriptions were for multiple players to use. He was fined privately by the club $5,000. In 2005, Cousins and Gardner were again questioned by police regarding their communications with motorcycle gangs after a gunfight in a Perth nightclub. The club informed the public that this may be their last chance at the Eagles. Everything listed so far is just the tip of the iceberg, as it got significantly worse over the next 2 years. And the easy question is, how did these players get away with all this? And the answer with most of these situations is the same. On field, the West Coast Eagles were incredible. In 2004, they finished 7th, with Chris Judd winning the Brownlow medal. In 2005, they finished 2nd, and Ben Cousins himself took home the highest individual honour. That year, they would make the grand final, only to just fall short to one of the greatest plays in history.
One last roll of the dice for the Eagles! Leo Barry, you star!
West Coast were building in a big way, and when sports teams bring joy to cities and money to important people, certain things are often overlooked. And West Coast were dangerous. After being at the wrong end of the Bloods fairy tale in 2005, they were hungry, and they built a fortress out west, playing some of the most scintillating team footy the game had seen. They were aggressive, fast, and punishing, always finding a way to come back and put down teams who put a foot wrong. And they did it their way. They were brilliant on the field, and celebrated like no one else offered. They had the best of both worlds in an incredible era of AFL footy. In 06, they spent a lot of time on the top of the ladder, and they spent just as much time in nightclubs. Gardner was removed from the leadership group after an alcohol incident the night before a game. Cousins fined $750 after abandoning a car and fleeing a booze bus in Perth. Gardner suspended by the club after a DUI where he hit 2 cars, and there's more to come. And yet, they just kept on winning. They were formidable. They went 17-5, only dropping a couple of games mid-season around the controversy of Gardner's off-field incidents. But they were nearly indestructible. They had one of the best midfields in history, with a prime Cousins running around with Andrew Embley sprinting off the wing, Chris Judd and Daniel Kerr following the footy at every contest, and one of the greatest ruckmen of all time in Dean Cox giving them first service. Their tall timber of Quinton Lynch, Tyson Stengland and Ashley Hansen gave a plethora of targets, while Darren Glass and Beau Waters were impossible to get past, with David Wirapunda one of the best running backs to do it. They narrowly dropped the qualifying final by a single point to Sydney, 84-85, in the most eerie scoreline ever, considering what would happen 3 weeks later. They rinsed the Dogs on a wet track in Perth the next week, and then defeated Adelaide in a cracking preliminary final at Amy Stadium. Sydney made a cracking run to get into the grand final from 4th place, and the date was set for the sequel. The second grand final matchup in as many years between Sydney and West Coast, and it was even better than the last. McVeigh and Cousins getting into it before the bounce on a sunny Saturday afternoon as the Eagles started fast. If you have a chance to watch the 06 grand final highlights, do it. This game was played with incredible skill, toughness and pace, showing some of the best forgotten stars in the league trading blows and goals. West Coast took a 16-point lead into quarter time after the Swans couldn't find the middle of the boot in front of goal. The second quarter was better for the Weagles, with their midfield dominance paying dividends. Daniel Kerr came into his own, and the devastating run of Judd, Cousins, Fletcher, and most importantly Embley was in full flight. They took a 25-point lead to the half. The third quarter saw the championship calibre of Nick Davis, Michael O'Loughlin and Adam Goodes on display to reduce the margin to 11, despite Quinton Lynch kicking one of the great goals from the half-forward flank.
It's going! It's going! It's gone!
The fourth quarter of the 2006 Grand Final is one of the best quarters of football there's ever been. The atmosphere, the run, the carry, the timely exchange of goals. It was the perfect encapsulation of why this game is as successful as it is. The Goodes goal, the Kerr run, the O'Keefe goal, the Chick smother, the Buchanan fend off to a foreshadowing Malcheski goal. It had everything. Sydney rushed back to be down by a point before going goal for goal all the way until that boundary throw in. And that Anthony Hudson call that lives in folklore forever.
Who would have thought the sequel would be just as good as the original?
The West Coast Eagles were the premiers. After everything that team had done off-field, all the money given to the AFL, all the suspensions served and all the media critique, they did it. The unthinkable. They were champions, and they did it their way.
Make a grand finals, let alone win one, is something that's we remember the rest of our lives.
Can you describe?
But if they did it their way to get to the premiership, why would they stop once they'd won it?
Drug rumours surrounded the talented midfielder in 2006. He was rushed to hospital and almost died after collapsing on a footy trip as the Eagles' premiership team partied in Las Vegas.
Assault charges, illicit substance infringements, the Eagles just didn't quit. And after climbing to the top of the mountain, it seemed like they had voluntarily jumped straight off the peak. It was revealed that it was Chad Fletcher who had collapsed in Las Vegas at an end-of-season footy trip and was hospitalised for 4 days. And that was only the beginning of incidents following the flag. Which means it's about time to talk about the elephant in the room. The Prince of Perth, one Ben Luke Cousins. One of the most memorable football players ever. Brownlow medal, MVP, 6-time All-Australian and 4 club championships. And he's remembered for none of that. Instead, Cousins is remembered for his crippling substance abuse problem throughout his AFL career that harboured potentially one of the greatest careers of all time. Prior to the 2007 season, Cousins and Daniel Chick arrived late to a substance test, before Cousins was then suspended by the club for missing training. He spent 4 weeks in California in a rehab facility, and in the meantime, John Worsfold and Chairman Dalton Gooding admitted that the Eagles had a substance abuse problem. Upon Cousins coming back to the club, West Coast imposed strict restrictions on what he could and could not do in and around the club. Although his comeback football was impressive, an injury ended his year in 07, and the off-season from hell would begin.
Tonight, the end of a football legend's life. Police investigate the sudden death of Chris Mainwaring.
On the 1st of October 2007, former Eagles champion Chris Mainwaring was found dead after an overdose. It was revealed that Cousins had visited him twice on the day of his passing and saw a large quantity of illicit substances. A mere 15 days later, Cousins was arrested for possession, and the Eagles sacked him the next day, citing him as being terribly sick. Shortly after, Andrew Demetrio and the AFL Commission banned Cousins from playing AFL for 12 months. He was officially delisted in November of 2007. And thus concluded the saga, as it were, within the mid-2000s. When Chris Judd requested a trade home to Victoria, it was all over. West Coast would dwell near the bottom of the ladder for the next 3 years, leading to a massive list turnover. John Worsfold, after the 2007 semi-final loss, severely criticised a number of players by name for derailing the team's season through off-field issues in what appeared to be the first open internal criticism of the team. Up to that point, the Eagles had been relatively negligent when it came to these issues, which is worth discussing. William Gillard's report made note that post-2006, the Eagles had an adequate response to off-field issues, but prior to that, he specifically lists John Worsfold and Chief Executive Trevor Nisbet as allowing a culture to fester, having been told on multiple occasions about issues and doing not enough to deter such actions. And it's true. Notice that after every off-field issue, even the ones that involved the law, a fine was generally the only consequence. Little to no suspensions, and a lot of empty threats of further action. While it appeared that John Worsfold and the leaders of the club denounced and hated the off-field culture, no one had the gall to make serious change because, well, the Eagles were just too good. They were winning, and no one wanted to break the code. It was concluded that the Eagles simply denied that substance abuses existed at the club, and held the public mentality that what their players did in their personal lives was up to them. Daniel Chick spoke to the Herald Sun in 2015 and said that club staff hid players from tests and provided players with prescription medication. The club denied those allegations. In tow, the AFL rarely stepped in, Demetrio and Mike Fitzpatrick taking until 2007 to request a report, and only taking action on the issues found after the report was requested. But the damage was done. West Coast Football Club was never punished for their inaction or complacency with the information that their players were taking part in all sorts. Part of the reason for this was that to punish West Coast was to admit that the league had a problem, and moreover, that the famed 3 strikes policy was not working, an opinion that many hold to this day. There's a lot of speculation as to why West Coast were able to get away with things like this. For one, this era was probably the last where players and clubs were not afraid to lose sponsorship over off-field issues. Companies these days are very afraid of being associated with controversy, as many brands have been boycotted through association. As such, clubs are very quick to nib this stuff in the bud, handing out suspensions and fines to players as soon as possible in order to distance themselves from the activity. But the mid-2000s were a strange period before this stage, but when the television coverage in journalism was as advanced as it had ever become. And it makes you wonder what teams got away with prior to this. The other idea that is most prominent when discussing the Eagles of this era is the fact that anyone that plays for the West Coast Eagles is a rock star. Perth is one of Australia's biggest cities, but unlike Sydney and Brisbane, it's an AFL first city. And unlike Melbourne, it's only a 2-team town, with the Eagles dominating the state's support. The Eagles are such a popular force in Perth that you can't be a player without getting all the media attention and popularity. Because of this, the media and general public are very forgiving of players in controversy, because the Eagles doing well is in everybody's best interests. In Victoria, where there are 10 teams, no one has a vested interest in protecting one particular club. But in Perth, as a footy player, it's pretty easy to get away with just about anything, because you know that the inhabitants and press coverage of the city will have your back. So, how will this Eagles team be remembered? Because ultimately, the Eagles were one of the best teams to watch of the modern era. But even achieving the ultimate goal wasn't enough for them to be historically recognised. Everyone remembers the Leo Barry mark and the Swans' drought-breaking flag, but hardly anyone talks about the comeback kings. So it begs 2 questions. Firstly, how will they be remembered? And more importantly, how good could they have been?
went down at West Coast is due to a lack of leadership from the top down. It easily could have been avoided. I'd give up my premiership medallion for another 100 games to the Hawks easily because of the way I've been treated or was treated.
The flag team has been as much talked about off-field as it's been forgotten on it, and the general public largely deemed that West Coast era to have a pretty big asterisk next to it. The grand final was incredible. Dean Bilton called it pure one-on-one footy, free of zones and presses, and it was electrifying. It's a terrible shame that the culture of the club, and more so the actions of a few, have tainted the fame and celebration of the premiership for most of the incredible talents of that team. David Wirapunda, Darren Glass, Beau Waters, Ash Hansen, some of the true characters of football lost in the controversial shadow of their teammates. And of course, you just wonder, had the team not had all those distractions, and had some of their stars not been battling serious addiction, whether they could have gone on to win a few more and become one of the greatest teams in history. But for now, it's important to recognise that the sequel was truly just as good as the original.